morning. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. We're going to give it a few more minutes before we get started. I see folks are still joining, so hang tight. And Lori, I think we lost your slides. I'm going to pull those back up. We can go ahead and get started.
Okay, let me try this one more time. There we go.
Perfect. All right. I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. So good morning, everyone. I am Sarah Potter. I'm the Education Program Manager with John Burton Advocates for Youth. I'd like to thank you for joining us today for our webinar on engaging foster youth in career exploration and motivating change. Through our SB 12 learning communities, we've learned that many child welfare caseworkers, probation officers, and other adult supporters of foster youth aren't always sure how to approach conversations on career and college planning. Today's webinar will provide strategies on how to expand conversations beyond what do you want to be when you grow up to help youth explore their options and interests when it comes to future goals. Next slide, please. Before we launch into the content today, I wanted to share some quick logistical information with you. If you have questions during the web seminar, you can use the questions panel to type your question. We will do a question and answers at the end of the presentation, but feel free to send your questions at any point during the webinar. If we are unable to get to all of the questions today, we will respond to you directly by email. If you have any technical problems during the webinar, you can use this same panel to communicate with us. Finally, the audio and video recording of today's webinar will be posted on the websites listed if you would like to share the content with others or listen again at a future time. We'll also be posting the PowerPoint if you'd like to have it for future reference. Next slide. So next, I would like to introduce Lori Collier. She is the Director of the Opportunity Youth Collaborative, a project of the Alliance for Children's Rights, where she leads collective impact efforts to improve educational and employment outcomes for transition age foster youth. We're excited to have her here today to share with us practical tips and strategies to engage youth in career and college planning. And with that, Lori, take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Lori Collier, and I'm Director of the LA Opportunity Collaborative, which we also refer to the OYC. Hang on one second. There we go. I'm just going to skip that slide. And what the LA Opportunities Collaborative is a collective impact initiative. We're working with over 7 local organizations here in Los Angeles who are working together across sectors to improve the education and employment outcomes for transition age foster. And we bring together a cross-sector collaborative to think about how do we move systemic barriers that young people face as they're aging out of care. And so part of the collaborative is anchored in public partners, CBO partners, philanthropy, young people themselves, and employers, as we want to build a continuum to help young people find a career path that pays a family-sustaining wage. And with that, just to start this conversation, I just want to have you to kind of think about these questions. How many jobs will the average person have in their lifetime? How many career changes will the average American have in their lifetime? And what percentage of Americans report being satisfied with their jobs? And so for question number one, and usually we do this with like an interactive poll, but for this purpose, we're not going to do that. The average person in their lifetime will have C, 12 to 15 jobs. The average American changes careers sectors 3 to 7 times. And the percentage of Americans that report being satisfied with their jobs is B, 51%. And most of the reasons they report being satisfied are around income. If they change careers, it's because they don't find their work interesting. And this was taken from a USA Today survey. And when we send out the slides, these are all things that you could use in a presentation if you find that to be helpful. Okay, so I wanted to start and kind of like frame this conversation of how do you work with young people to find a career path that's interesting to them. And one of the things we wanted to really kind of hone in on as practitioners is that having the ability to dream and imagine is so important, because that's how you find hopefulness. And foster youth often struggle in their survival, in their ongoing crises, and the various barriers that they present. And those things are casualties. The greatest casualty of trauma is not only depression and the emotional scars, but it's the loss of the ability to dream and imagine another way. And so as practitioners, it's important for us to help inspire young people to dream. How do we help them see themselves beyond of where they see themselves today and imagine what their life could look like into the future? And I'm going to go through a lot of different tips and suggestions to kind of help bring that to life as you're in a dialogue with a young person who may be struggling to see themselves outside of the struggles that they're presently in. And specifically as practitioners, it's thinking about how do we engage with foster youth and thinking about how we come to the relationship. And so being very mindful is that in this work, we are the tool, and it's responsibility of us to keep ourselves fresh and engaged and understand our limitations and understand our expertise. And I often give the analogy to staff that I'm working with, it's just like going to a construction site. If your hammer's broken, you're going to need to find a new one or borrow one from someone else or have somebody help you figure out how to solve the issue. And in our profession, there's not a lot of support around that. So we have to figure out how do we kind of bring ourselves to the table to make sure every day we have the skills needed to support young people that we're working with. And so we have PACE is the attitude that we're talking about, and playfulness is huge. When you're talking to young people, you know, a willingness to laugh or joking about a situation, or if something's difficult, kind of making light of it, pulls an individual out of that fight or fright frontal lobe limbic condition. And it's really important because if foster youth are struggling with housing or mental health issues or food insecurity, being able to kind of bring back that playfulness into a conversation kind of helps lighten the mood and moves the youth into, you know, ready to understand and listen to the conversation that you're about to have. As a staff person, it's our duty to accept and build the context of safety and connection. Just because we're accepting what a young person is bringing to the table doesn't mean we're necessarily agreeing with it. And there's a difference. And so we have spent a lot of time talking with staff. They say, well, if they accept that this is what their truth is, then that means we're agreeing with it, and it kind of helps the young person stay stuck. And so to push back on that, it's to really saying is that accepting a young person where they are, meeting them where they are, and helping them move along to the journey by supporting them through, and they can help do some reality testing to make sure that the young person is present, can help move that conversation along, and that acceptance isn't necessarily agreeing with what the situation is being presented. Curiosity is the hallmark of social engagement. It pulls an individual out of the fear or anger states, and it helps us point out where possibilities could be. It begins to support decreased stress reaction and increased parasympathetic tone. And so making sure that curiosity is asking a question of, you know, kind of going deeper than how are you today, but it's really kind of being very meaningful when you say, you know, how are things going? What's going on with you? And checking in with a young person so they feel seen, they feel heard, they feel cared about. Those all build a relationship for a young person to be able to open up, to talk about what's happening with them. And the last thing is empathy. The experience of being understood and developed is something that foster youth haven't experienced. Being seen and heard is something they talk about is not been a normal event. And so how do we kind of move ourselves to make sure that we're empathizing with what young people are experiencing, and help kind of bring the guard down and to have more curiosity about what's happening so we can figure out what are the resources that we need, what are the barriers we need to clear, and how do we make a strong connection to what a youth is bringing. And when we're talking about this in terms of career exploration, these are all the points of conversation that would bring us to talking about, like, what are they good at? What have they tried? What are they interested in? And so many times when I've sat down with a young person, they'll say, I'm not good at anything. And so then it's kind of backtracking and having a conversation. Well, what do you do in your free time? And you know, having a whole conversation with a young man about, well, I like to rebuild computers. And it was like, oh my gosh, he didn't realize that was a skill because it was something that he enjoyed. He didn't know that it was a career path that he could kind of learn more about. And so through the dialogue and that connection, we were able to reflect and explore what those interests were. Then we could talk about what reality testing looks like. Is that a career path? How does that look? What's the planning necessary? Like, what's the educational plan that you would need to have a job in that space? And then finally, how do you network and form peer connections that help you get to where you want to be? And this isn't a linear process. I want to say on the slide, it looks very linear. You may kind of jump around in these sections multiple times with a young person as they're exploring, and that's really okay. And I'm going to go into depth about each of these 4 topics as we go through this conversation. So to start with, reflection and exploration, what does that look like? There's a bunch of tools, and all of these, when Sarah sends out the slides, these are hyperlinked into the deck, so you can kind of go and explore them. But I want to show you this particular one right here called California Career Zone. It's the one we use the most. And I'm going to open up my screen. And so California Career Zone is a free website. You can take a youth here, they can open an account, and then doing an interest profiler helps the young person explore what they'd be interested in. Oh wait, this is not the one. It's the quick assessment that I think I want. Nope, that's not it either. Okay, I'm gonna go back to the slides. Sorry about that. Get myself reorganized. There we go. Technical, okay. Okay, so it's discover possibilities. Skills profiler. I'm sorry, I'm struggling with the right section on this. Quick assessment. Okay, I think I have the right, this is still not the right one. Okay, I'm struggling here to find the right place. There's an, this is not it. This is what I want right here. Okay, my apologies, everyone. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so this is the mini profiler, and when I send it out, I'll send you the correct links to get to exactly which one. So in the interest profiler, what this is a series of 30 questions that a young person just thinks about. Do you like to build kitchen cabinets? Would you like to develop a new medicine? Write books? And I'm just gonna go through randomly and pick a bunch of answers to these questions just to show you what it looks like at the very end. Beauty salon. Okay, and summarize. Okay, so this tells me that kind of what my top interests are, and it scores it, and there's a whole section that talks about which those are. And then it brings us to, these are the potential jobs that I could be interested in. And so it talks about urban and regional planners, landscape architects, engineering. And so over here, it talks about, these are videos about what these jobs look like. It tells you the score based on how I clicked. And I'm just gonna click on landscape architects so you can see what that looks like. So this helps guide a conversation with a young person as they're exploring careers. It talks about the average salary is $90,000 in California. The annual openings are 270. That tells you this job is not really in demand in California because there's such a small amount of annual openings. And then it tells you what they do. They talk with clients about architect projects for landscape, preparing the sites, cost estimates for land development. It talks about like what those education and trainings could look like as far as what to major in. It tells you what the work values are. So you'd be independent, but you'd also be working in collaboration to achieve goals to the job. And then things that you would need to know about, kind of list through like some of the things that would be a part of this industry. Things you'd be able to have skills of: active listening, reading comprehension, coordinating, speaking. And then it kind of walks you through other types of jobs. And this helps develop a language for the young person to start to know about, because oftentimes no one's really talked to a foster youth about what their job could be, what they're interested in, and what does that translate into as terms of like a language that young people don't understand, because maybe they've never heard of a curator or didn't realize that an art director was an actual job. And so this is a really great tool for younger youth that may have no idea of what they're interested in doing. And it helps them start to explore it. And we recommend, if you're doing this with younger youth, you do it every 6 months. And if you're doing it around 18 or 19, to kind of dive into this, because it really starts to show what you're more interested in. And this helps young people kind of set goals. And we'll talk about that a little bit further as we move along. Another website linked here is called My Plan. It's a very similar type of platform. It goes through and it talks about a values assessment. What are the things that you value? So if you value autonomy or comprehension or working with coworkers, then it has these different types of career titles that help young people understand, like, these are all different jobs that you could look for. If you Google sculptors, Los Angeles, it could pop up, and it helps explain what that means. And then over here, this is an example of what you would see. So this is for an animal control worker. The job description is handle animals for the purpose of investigation of maltreatment or control. It talks about what kind of experience and what type of education that you would need in order to enter into this as a profession. And then it also talks about like the average salary of what that profession makes across the United States. I prefer California Career Zone because it's customized to wherever you are in California based on your zip code. So when a young person fills out a profiler, it helps kind of bring it really down to the local level so young people can understand what those opportunities are. And then when you start having the conversations about, you know, how much education does it require and what does the annual salary look like, having conversations about reality testing then start to become a real need. And so helping young people understand what mean earnings are versus the cost of living and lifestyle needs. And what that essentially means is that when young people are having a dialogue about how much money they want to earn, sometimes they don't understand what are the cost of living versus lifestyle. And so when we have groups of youth come together, we ask like a bunch of questions is, is having a dating budget line item, is that a need or a want? And so getting your nails done, is that a need or a want? And having that conversation with young people in community is interesting because they get to have a conversation back and forth, because some people think it's a need and some people think it's a want. And then they usually kind of talk about, well, if you have to pay internet, is that a need or a want? And so it really starts to drive down to helping youth understand what is a basic need and what is a want, and figuring out how do they make a budget for themselves. And then thinking about, is they're looking at a career path, if they want to be a social worker, as a lot of youth do, understanding that's a 6-year educational path. It's a bachelor's degree plus a master's degree, and talking about the return on investment of how much a social worker makes straight out of grad school compared to a landscape architect. And so having them understand that maybe if you got a certificate in phlebotomy, that could earn just as much money with less education, but entering into the workforce faster versus the 6 years of education that it requires to be a social worker with a master's degree. And young people haven't been exploring those educational requirements and costs. We also do a lot of talking about how much post-secondary education costs in terms of the for-profit or private like UEI or American Career College versus their local schools. So helping young people understand the differences of cost between education is also an important requirement as you're looking at like how long does it take to finish something and what are the costs and what makes sense for that young person. We also talk about how many jobs are available in that sector. Young people will talk about they want to do something in the video game industry, and then we have to, as you go through the profiler, you can see is that industry in demand or is it not in demand? And so as you walk through, it's being very important about using humor, also kind of listening with empathy, and then doing some reality testing and agreeing with the youth that a video game job, kind of hearing that that's their interest, instead of saying, oh, don't do that. You really want to hear like, what is it about that you really enjoy? So you can dig in a little bit deeper around what those things are that are interesting for them, and then maybe figure out another avenue of like, what's their plan B? And then when you get into this opportunity of talking about career earnings and young people struggling with like how much a job pays, this wage earner is a very interesting tool that we have used to help young people step through how much money do they need to live. And I'm going to go for Los Angeles. And we'll do here. Okay, that's not working. Let's try this again. Sorry for my technology challenges. Los Angeles County. And so showing like what those wages are helps a young person to start to understand like how much money is required. And just kind of talking about, here's one adult with children, and trying to help like show, here's the living wage, here's the poverty wage, and here's the minimum wage. And so how do we think about making sure youth understand that a career path is a better option versus getting stuck into some dead-end jobs, and thinking about how do we help them move through their career path of where they want to be as they're kind of growing in their trajectory. And so this really talks about like different types of annual salaries. So having conversations about what these industries are and exposure to these industries is also something we've been working on. If you only know about, exposure only shows you what you know, which is generally for foster youth, it's social workers, probation officers, or law enforcement. or a medical profession. And so it's opening up the opportunities of what does it mean to be in an administrative office, and what do those jobs do? And is that something that a young person would be interested for in a career? But it requires exposure to those opportunities to know what that means. The same thing with construction. We've been talking about how do we take young people to different construction sites to have exposure for them. And as we've been in COVID talking about how do we like put a GoPro on somebody's helmet and walk them through the construction site of SoFi Stadium that's being built, just to have like an experience of walking through what that would look like, because we can't do it in person right now, but doing those virtual explorations is something that's still very valuable to give young people an idea of like what that job actually looks like. And then the last one here is the Salary Surfer website, also another great resource that helps young people understand like what salaries could look like. And these are all hyperlinked in the PowerPoint, so you can check those out as you're looking through of like how would you use these tools with young people. Okay, and then so back to the career zone again. If young people are really struggling with this concept, this is two different choices of the same kind of survey. The one on the left is basically ask you like, what are all the things you want for your lifestyle? And the other one is like, pick your salary. And this has been really interesting journey with youth. And we have found that having them choose their lifestyle is the much easier way to have this conversation, because the idea of, again, what a need and a want is looks really different. And so asking them to complete this is a great way to talk about like, what are their choices? So if you are going to be living in LA, are you going to live with your parents? Are you going to rent an apartment? Do you want to buy your own place, or is your place already paid for? So most youth would say their choice would be to rent their own apartment. And then the question is are you going to have a mobile phone? Like what on here is basic necessities? And so the youth will go through and kind of pick which ones, they may not say TV, are they're interested in. They like to eat out, but nothing fancy. I'm just going to pick a couple of things. They're getting financial aid. They're not really saving too much. And so this helps then break down what are all the basic needs based on your lifestyle that you would need to make in order to be able to afford all the things you're interested in. And so this is a great tool because it talks about, and this is even low, like in Los Angeles, to find an apartment on your own for $1,100. Studios pretty much are renting for about $1,500 on average in LA right now. So that's a bit low. And then you walk through and say like, okay, here's all the things that I'm paying for or not paying for. And my minimum salary would need to be $24,000 a year or $2,000 a month. And this helps a young person think about what does that budget look like? And how do I develop a budget that's realistic for me? And this is a skill that I think youth have to have over and over and over again, because it's one of the things is that it doesn't stick until you really need it. And so the more often a youth kind of understands what the wants and the needs are and how do they balance all their works, maybe they'd be willing to say, okay, maybe I don't want my own apartment, I'm willing to have a roommate. Or maybe I don't need this, but I need that. And it helps young people make informed decisions and figure out how they want to spend their money. And for us as the practitioners, engaging in these conversations can be really challenging. And doing it from a way of having some vulnerability on our part, I think is something we've been talking to the facilitators that facilitate groups that we use to help talk about career paths. And we talk about using storytelling or personal anecdotes to form the relationship to the young person. Of course, keeping in mind there are boundaries there about how you use your personal story. And what we've learned is that when you walk into a room of foster youth and we go in and we start talking about it, whatever the topic of the day is, most youth think we just land in these jobs. And we've started kind of moving back to say like, what was your first job? And if you walk around a room and ask all the adults in the room, what was your first job? Most of us would say McDonald's, JCPenney's, Baskin Robbins, some sort of customer service job was where we all started. And so how do we start to help foster youth know, like, first jobs aren't, we don't just land in the roles that we're in. We've worked ourselves through a career path to be in these spaces. But most of these customer service jobs that we have are teaching us skills that are translatable that we've learned along on our career path. And so telling personal stories about maybe you got fired from your first job and you'd share a little bit about you didn't know that being late on the time clock 3 minutes was a big deal. And you were multiple times late for a variety of issues, and that wound up getting you fired from your job. And most young people are really surprised to hear that if you're on a time clock and you're late, that's a grounds for termination. And so having those conversations is key, because these normalize like things that happen to us, and it doesn't make us bad or not good. It's just things that we didn't know that we learn along the way. And what we talk to staff about is really sticking to facts. So that way you're not talking about something that's a perception. It's a factual thing around in California. This is what the law says, and this is how it's applied if you're an hourly worker. And then talking to young people about asking them personal questions about like what their interests are or what happened versus advising them on what to do. And the difference on that is really key, because young people want to be able to make their own decisions. And if they make a decision based on advice that you gave, and then they followed through with that advice and something goes wrong, they're going to come back and say to you, I did what you said and here's what happened. And so it's really kind of sitting in a space to let a young person have the ability to make a decision, and for us as practitioners to ask those key questions that help them get to what is it that they want to do, kind of like what's the feeling behind whatever the struggle is, and how do they decide what the right answer for them is. And those can all just be sitting through, back to the PACE slide that I talked about earlier in the presentation, is, you know, how do we sit through playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy to make sure a young person is able to make those decisions, and we're supporting them through that process. And then the idea of goal setting comes, you know, kind of naturally as you're building this relationship. And it's important to have both short and long-term goals, so we know, you know, kind of what we're trying to do and what are the steps we need to do immediately. And when I say long-term goals, I don't mean like the ultimate desired goal. Maybe it's just, what's your goal for this school year? And then kind of back into like, what are some of the short-term goals we need to meet in order for you to finish this school year on time? And goals should not always be related to education and employment. Maybe there's an issue with substance abuse, or maybe there's an issue with housing. And so making sure, or a childcare issue. So that way, any of those kind of auxiliary barriers or challenges that youth may deal with that could impede their education and employment goals are being discussed and resolved as their issues. And then motivation, you know, asking a young person kind of what keeps them going. As you go through the school year, young people are going to start and stop and struggle in different ways. And I found it's always really important in a conversation when a young person isn't struggling to say, so if we hit a road bump this year, what can we do? What can I do to help motivate you to kind of come back to center so we can kind of get back on the path together? Because everybody in life goes through bumps and bruises. And I just want to talk to you about what motivates you. Like, what can I say that will help kind of bring you back? And this conversation will help you as the staff person, like, know if you see a youth struggling, you've had this conversation. So it's kind of like a nudge, if you will, to remind them that something's happening and we need to get back to like what our goals are. And then finally, like identifying supports at each stage. There's another slide that's coming up. Identifying supports is huge. A lot of times youth don't realize there's all these different people that are around them and how to activate them. And so when we talk with a young person, it's not only talking about like who their friends are, but who is their mentor, or who is, if they have they've won the lottery, who are they going to call to talk about that? And have them think about all the different parts of themselves. So that way, as they are needing support, we've identified some of those places already. Because when you're in fight or flight mode, you might not always think about like who the person to call is. And this is an example of an action plan of what we would suggest to start a conversation with, is like, where do you want to go? What's your motivation? And kind of listing through what those goals are. And this really has helped young people kind of stay clear on, you know, what they're trying to accomplish, what any barriers that may be, and who can help them and when. So that way there's not too much time that happens between when there's an issue and when they ask for help. Sometimes if we solve the issue by asking for help sooner, we can resolve the issue faster and kind of move back to our regular plan again. And then engagement, you know, as you're having all these conversations, you know, how do you engage young people and what does that conversation look like? And we have found that the use of celebrities and the use of self and the use of conversations with others has been really powerful. So part of what we've talked about with young people is thinking about, you know, what was the first job of Barack Obama? And it surprises all young people that his very first job was at Baskin Robbins, or Tiffany Hadish's first job was at Alaska Airlines. Oprah Winfrey worked at a grocery store. Kevin Hart was a lifeguard. Kanye West folded clothes at the Gap. And the use of celebrities helps normalize because they're very easy things to research on the internet to see what the trajectory of a celebrity's kind of career path looked like. And some kind of like moved straight up and went straight into acting, but most really started kind of in the career paths that we all started in. And we use videos around different celebrities to help young people understand, you know, what that could look like. And Barack Obama is a great video that we've shared that's very powerful for youth. And I'm trying to get to that video, so I'm going to go right here.
On Barack Obama. Your mom comes from the Pacific Northwest, migrates to Hawaii, goes to college there, right away meets a dashing young Kenyan, gets pregnant.
That's me.
That's you. But your dad is gone before you ever become conscious. What did she tell you about your father? What was your impression of your dad as you grew up?
He was gone by the time I was 2. She could have been bitter, but she didn't communicate that to me. She would talk about how smart he was and how generous he was and how charismatic he was. And for a little boy, that's actually a good thing. It was only later in life where I started to stitch his life together where that mythology was toppled.
How did you internalize that?
Some of my drive comes from wanting to prove that he should have stuck around, that I was worthy of his attentions. You know, at a certain point, you get old enough where you realize you can't spend your whole life fighting ghosts. But there's no doubt that his absence had an impact on me, both negative and positive. You know, during my teenage years, I engaged in a bunch of self-destructive behavior. I drank, tried drugs. I didn't take my schoolwork seriously. And in that sense, when I see young men, standing on street corners in big cities around the country, who have probably grown up without fathers in the house, there's a part of me that can relate to them.
You look at Apollo.
And we've used that video with a number of groups, and then usually we sit down and have a whole conversation around how relatable is that story and how do we think about this was the president of the United States, and he had a whole journey of his life of starting out with a struggle and kind of how he moved up to his career path of ultimately being the president. And it's very interesting to hear young people talk about they didn't realize that those were some of the struggles that he had. And it's interesting when they start asking questions or relating it back to their own story. And so using celebrities and videos that talk about the struggles that we all have really starts to normalize the experience, so that way youth know they're not alone in a journey. Other people have walked in it too. Everyone has a story, but we have to think about, how do we take that story and move it into, how do we imagine our future to look differently? And so how do we inspire foster youth to dream about what could be different for them? And using these in the combination of using our own journey, the conversation that we have with young people that are part of their peer group, and in celebrities, has really engaged young people to think about and be able to start to dream about what they want to be. And then finally, we move into networking and peer connections. Learning all these things, reflecting on what interests you, thinking about what these options could be as I'm thinking about what I want to be in my career, and how does this all work together as I start my first job and move into my first professional job, is networking skills. And we don't really explicitly teach networking skills. So young people often say, what does it mean to network? How do you do that? And what is an elevator pitch? And we do a lot of role playing and practicing. We talk about what LinkedIn looks like and how to use LinkedIn. We actually in this section do a lot of talking about social media just in general, and explaining like the privacy settings on Instagram or on Facebook, mostly Instagram, and why keeping your pages private is important, especially in a job search. And then normalizing for young people the fact that they may not have large networks right now, and that's okay. The goal is to figure out is like, how do you start to network and meet people outside of their age group, and recognize that these adults that they're meeting in these different spaces could help them along the way, and doing informational interviews, and what does that mean? I can't stress the importance enough of talking about social media, and making sure that young people understand what LinkedIn is compared to social media accounts. And so we have to we've walked through youth to understand like what that looks like, why their pictures that they're posting, and their profile pictures down to their email addresses, around what professionalism is. So that way they understand, as you build a resume, you really need an email address that is your first name, last name, or maybe some numbers, and not like something. We've seen all kinds of crazy email addresses that are inappropriate if you're looking for a job. And with that, it's figuring out like, what do you say? How do you write your skills, or how do you talk about goals, or how do you have an elevator pitch to talk about what you're interested in? And how do you do it in a very brief amount of time, so that way if you have somebody's ear, you have your 15-second soundbite. And we use a video that I'm going to show you to explain what elevator pitches are.
I know less than we're looking forward to this one a little bit more, but in a general sense. No, yeah, operations is going much better than any of my other classes last semester. I'm looking forward to how that turns out. And I mean, I just can't believe, especially money, banking, please, I do what I do. Oh, hang on. I'm in the elevator with President Oldham right now. I didn't even, okay, hang on. No, stop, no, okay. Hey. And I mean, if you've got anybody in the college of business, or anybody that knows, if you need a qualified professional, somebody that will actually get the job done well, then you know what? You know who to talk to. All right, so, okay.
So that's an example of a terrible elevator pitch. And usually we show this whole video to young people so they can kind of see, but for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to go to the good one that we show to model. And so I'm getting right there.
Hey, President Oldham.
Hello.
My name is Jessica Terrell.
Hey, Jessica.
I'm a College of Business ambassador, and I'm also on the speech and debate team. I have some great ideas that could really help this college. I know you're a very busy man, but I would love to let you hear them.
I'd love to hear them. I'm just headed to lunch. I was going to grab a bite. You want to go talk now?
Yes, thank you. I love that.
That'd be great.
And so then working through, like, how do you craft that speech with a young person so they have an opportunity, they know exactly what to say. And young people usually get a pretty good kick out of some of the other videos that are there. And so thinking about, like, a lot of discussion then comes around, like, what do you say? How do you say it? What are my accomplishments? And foster youth sometimes can't identify those within themselves. So it's up to us as their supporters to help think about, well, you accomplished this great thing, or you did that. And these are all things you should, like, really talk about. And they're like, oh, okay. And having that positive sense of self isn't something that just kind of usually comes naturally. So making sure that, you know, in your conversations, you have the things that are ready. And then we also talk about, like, what are business cards? Why are they important? One of the tips that I give young people is to always ask professionals for business cards when they meet someone interesting. And then I encourage them to write on the back of that business card where they met them, and then to send an email. So that way they make an introduction email, but in the email they can say, hey, I met you at the Blue convening in you know, last week, and I just wanted to follow up to have a more of a discussion around whatever the interest is. And helping young people develop these tools is a key component of helping them feel more confident in themselves. Okay. And then finally, the circle of support. One of the things we've worked on with locally is we developed.
Hi, I'm Lauren Berger. This
Oh.
is my elevator pitch.
Ah,
Take one.
hang on a
Hi, I'm
second.
Lauren, and I want to do this, and I want to know. Oh my gosh.
Sorry about that. That surprised me. Okay. Okay, circle of support. One of the things that we have found really surprising is this was something that most every youth said in a formative evaluation that we did was the most important tool of the whole curriculum that we developed. And it was the page they said they referred to most often. And it's the circle of support. And it's talking about literally kind of quadranting it off and saying, who do you call for emotional support? Who is your informational support? Who is an active support if you need a reference letter, or if you need a reference for a scholarship or for a job? Who can you ask to be in that kind of active support category? And then who's somebody that offers you feedback on a resume or feedback on, you know, different questions to ask as you go to an interview? And helping young people think through this is really vital. What we've learned is that most young people don't know anyone older than the age of 25. And trying to think about who are the intergenerational resources of support that youth have around them. It could be a pastor, it could be a former foster parent, it could be a particular professor, scholars program. It could be a peer that maybe has a job that you know, has a resume. Having young people literally sit down, think about who these people are, write them on a sheet of paper with their names and phone numbers, because when a youth starts to struggle, they can refer back to this sheet and usually have them uploaded into a Google Drive to think about who can they call. And this is such a key component because young people don't often think about who that person could be. And we talk about professionally, I might not have talked to somebody for months, but if I have a question or need to reach out about something, I just reach back out and ask the question, and we just pick up our conversations wherever we left off. It's not a person that I have to engage with in a regular way, because in your professional network, you lean on other colleagues that you may have built over your career path, and helping foster youth understand that that's okay. And so it's been interesting to kind of hear some of their things that they talk about when you move through, like, what could this look like? But these active supports are really, and then finally, it's like, how do you create purpose? Part of what we found is creating nudges very intentionally are very successful. Show young people pictures of them, of, you know, somebody who looks like them in a different career path. And so having pictures kind of around your office space of different young people doing different types of careers helps them visualize and see themselves in a different space. Using positive words of encouragement to let them know like it's okay and we will move through this together. Using stories of other youth who have succeeded, talking about, you know, maybe there's a former foster youth that has, you know, is a lawyer and a young person's interested in being a lawyer, and that kind of that story of that journey helps that young person feel more motivated. Positive quotes, affirmations, meditation are all things, especially now young people have talked about it, that have been so helpful of how do they, if they find themselves feeling anxious and frustrated, what do they do to kind of move themselves back down to feeling kind of back within themselves again, so they can feel less anxious. And so meditation or affirmations has been something we've been doing with young people that's been very successful. And then helping youth visualize their potential, like literally have them think, and we talk about this a lot using a sports metaphor, and you hear this in a lot of YouTube videos, is that the visualization of shooting a three-point basket is oftentimes more effective than actually shooting the three-pointer, because in your mind, how you move your body is training a new brain pathway. And as you visualize yourself making that shot in your mind, when you actually then go to the court to make the shot, because you've visualized it so much, your body will naturally help you make that three-point shot. And if you use videos from LeBron James or Kobe Bryant to bring those conversations kind of forward, it helps young people think about how they see themselves. And it also reminds them about what their dreams and hopes are. And the more we can connect young people to those dreams and hopes and kind of move them along and see themselves differently, they're more likely to go on that path of supporting their own wants and dreams, because they're inspired to do that as an intrinsic motivation versus an external motivation. I know I've talked a lot, and I wanted to pause here to see if there's questions or things that you guys want to know about that maybe I didn't dive as deep onto, that you're curious to know more about.
Thank you, Lori. This is Sarah again, and I just wanted to remind folks that you can enter your questions into your control panel. We do have one question, Lori, and it is about the frequency in which you engage with young people around these career and sort of college planning conversations. And so the question states that the person is working with youth as young as 16, and they know that their dreams and aspirations can change over time. So is there a recommendation about how frequently or how often to check in and re-engage on these conversations, knowing that things might shift for them?
So the Career Zone webpage is what we say for youth that age to do about every 6 months, because their dreams do change pretty quickly during that time, and they kind of move about to different things. And so if you go through that interest profiler and have them do it about once every 6 months, that's a good kind of baseline to check in on, especially as they're kind of moving towards being a high school senior, is to kind of hone in on doing a little bit more exploration around those topics. So if there's internships or informational interviews that young people can do as they're making the transition from high school to post-secondary, so they understand like what's their major or what are they interested in exploring once they get to their post-secondary opportunities as they're going through their general ed classes, to kind of keep them engaged in what they think they want to be. So often we kind of get foster youth to post-secondary, but the persistence is a struggle. And so how do we kind of start to layer in these opportunities for exploration that keep them engaged and connected to resources and supports that can help them move through the barriers that present themselves?
Excellent, thank you. And I see that we have one more question. Again, it's about sharing the presentation. And so yes, we will actually post a recording and share the slides. They'll be posted on the JBay website. So at the end of the presentation, I will make sure that those get posted later today, and I'll send an email out to all of the attendees on how to access those.
And I'll drop in like the interest profiler, so that way it's very clear with like what links to which site, so that way people don't kind of stumble through like I did in the middle of the presentation. So trying to look for the right thing, so I can make that very explicit for folks.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Lori. This was incredibly helpful. And I love the tools and the resources that you presented because I think they feel very tangible and they feel very youth-friendly and engaging. So I think a lot of us are going to find them helpful when we're working with young people. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording.